You've got like a lot of anger and whatever on social media, and then people don't participate. And I think the key thing that you need to do is you need to take the places where there's energy, and then you need to have that energy not be dissipated in heat, instead be converted into work. So that's what they try to do. It's like they try to just say, oh, you're feeling like having a flame war on Twitter? How about you use that in a engine where that actually is sort of guaranteed to generate useful policy proposals rather than to just go up in heat.
In today's episode, we are talking to Glen Weyl, a political economist, research lead at Microsoft Research, and founder of Radical Exchange. He wrote Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society, and more recently, co-authored Plurality, Technology for Social Innovation, alongside Audrey Tang, Taiwan's former digital minister. Glen's work focuses on innovative economic models and digital democracy, aiming to reimagine systems for a more regenerative and inclusive future. To me, this was a really interesting conversation and we touched upon many different topics. And it often feels like in our society, when we're talking about technological innovation and progress, we don't talk enough about innovation in our social structures too. So I really enjoyed some of Glen's insight into the systems that he's been working on to advance that. Maya, what's your key takeaway?
What really stood out to me is the broad nature of Glen's work. We went from mechanisms for depolarization and lessons for building digital democracies, all the way to the challenges of creating open source content and the role of spirituality in technology. So let us know what you think, leave a comment, and share this episode with a friend. Let's dive in.
Today we're welcoming Glen Weyl, a political economist, researcher at Microsoft Research and founder of Radical Exchange. Glen, we are super excited to have you here and discuss some of your work, especially around social imagination through concepts like plurality. Welcome.
It's my pleasure to be here with you too.
Yes, hi Glen. We're so honored to have you on our show. And let's open with a big one right away. So what do you see as some of the primary issues with our economic and democratic system today?
Well, look, any democratic political system, economy, etc., allows people to interact with each other, and in our case, across the whole world. And the challenge is always that we can interact much more deeply with a few people that we're close to than we can with people who are on the other side of the world that we've never met, who have totally different value systems. So we're always in a struggle in this sort of trade-off between being able to have these rich, deep connections with a few people we're close to and very thin ones with people further away. And communication technologies like we're using to talk right now are always about trying to get us a little bit closer, allow us to have a little bit richer connections with people a little bit further away. And really, I view the evolution of political and economic systems as just that idea writ large. So we need ways to allow capitalism to capture more of the depth of our connections for our voting systems, to represent our social relationships better, and to travel across broader contexts, not to be so rigid. So all the work I do is really trying to push back on those things. And while we can talk about particular problems or political things, whatever, I think they're all just sort of projections of the limits of our ability to interact richly and at scale.
And you mentioned technology, obviously, as a big layer for this. And I wonder, what do you see how do you see the evolving relationship between democracy and technology? Because in your work, you outline three potential futures. There's the synthetic technocracy, corporate libertarianism, and digital democracy. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about all of these scenarios?
Yeah, so one scenario that people talk a lot about is a giant machine does everything for you and everybody gets a UBI. And I think this is kind of the default vision that you hear in the tech world. There's also one that's very popular in the crypto world, which is like all these protocols, get rid of the need for governments, get rid of the need for unions, and maybe any kind of group of people, and everything is just like some hyper-capitalist thing with individuals interacting in markets. And I think both of these are kind of antithetical, actually, to the notion of a network. The basic idea of a network that underlies, the internet is that we have a diversity of relationships with a diversity of people. We're more connected to some than to others. There's all these kind of like partial relationships, partial connections. And that's also the basic idea of life. In life, you have organisms, and inside of them are cells, and they're organized into organs, and then they live in ecosystems. And all of these are kind of like partially enclosed environments with some relationships outside. And I'm like pro-life, in that sense. I'm all in favor of that richness and complexity, and not like the monolith does everything, or like everything is just free to do whatever. Like everything's about that kind of interdependence, interconnection, partial relationships, regeneration, flow, etc.
I like that you mentioned that, because obviously your co-author Audrey Tang talks about something similar, like how we can work with these complexities to code up our political systems. So how does that look like, and what are some of the mechanisms that we can leverage for that?
I'll give a very concrete example. So in Taiwan, they have this thing Gov0, G0V, which is like .gov, but instead .g0v. And so what they do is they download government websites, people improve on them and put them at .g0v, and then try to shame the government into adopting that better public service. And that ended up becoming really important to the country, to its success in COVID. It ended up leading my co-author, Audrey, who you mentioned, to become the digital minister in charge of that process.
But let's dive a little bit deeper in the Taiwan example, actually, because you talk a lot about Taiwan in your work, and Audrey Tang is a collaborator on your book, and you just mentioned even like drawing from life's patterns, right, for kind of how do we organize communities, and one of your talks, you even have you explain plurality through this kind of diagram of intersecting circles. And a fun fact is that sort of how we visualize the themes for our podcast. So I really love that visual. So can you dive a bit deeper into plurality and why Taiwan is such a good example of applying this? Like why creating this Gov0 movement become so successful?
Well, I think there are two things that are really special about Taiwan. One is that Taiwan's economy is 50% the export of digital technology, more than twice the next highest country in the world. So like Taiwan is not going to live and survive without technology thriving. And at the same time, its whole identity, the reason that it's able to stay as an independent entity, is because of its democratic government. And that's the existential thing that it's about defending. And so Taiwan is a place where like technology and democracy have to thrive, because they won't have a life without democracy, and they won't have a livelihood without technology. And so they don't have the option of having these things being in conflict with each other. They have to make them work together. And at the same time, Taiwan is like, in many ways, one of the most diverse places in the world. It's the second most religiously diverse place in the world. It's a place where like, a good chunk of the population believes that they are China. They're just like the free version of China. And another chunk believes that they're an island and they just happen to speak Chinese. And like, what do they have to do with China? And so you've got these completely divergent visions of like what the society is. The ethnicity thing is all completely mixed up, because like they were Polynesian and they were colonized by Europeans, and then they were colonized by the Chinese, then they were colonized by the Japanese. So it's like a whole mess. And so they've got this like radical diversity, and they have a neighbor that is not exactly friendly, and they're like the flashpoint for what would be for World War III. So they've got like insane diversity and have to somehow come together. And so like both this like necessity of putting democracy and technology together, and necessity of like making a virtue of their own internal divisions, I think is what has made Taiwan such like a breeding ground for like thinking about new forms of democracy.
And specifically, I read about the Polis, which is a real-time system for, gathering, analyzing, understanding what large group of citizens think, and kind of helping them make sense of it. Can you maybe share a little bit about Polis specifically, or different mechanisms that have been deployed in Taiwan?
Yeah, so there was something, so before the 1940s, media in the United States was actually even more polarized than it is today. And then there was this thing called the Hutchin Commission, where the media decided that they were going to like implement social interest principles, which is that we're going to figure out like objective fact-based news. And then on things that are divisive, we're going to show both sides, right? And so that was like big media companies with huge budgets in centralized way in the United States, which is the most powerful country in the world. So the question is, can we do that in an agile way for like any conversation that any random set of people might want to have? And that's what Polis is about. What Polis does is it uses machine learning to take organic comments that are sort of in a Twitter-like format and turn them into like, here are the different sides of the conversation and here's what people agree on. And so that's what it does. And it's been used in Taiwan to pass a bunch of legislation and to give people sort of a depolarizing experience for social media, which is really important because the most effective attacks that China does are actually not cyber attacks. They're not or standard cyber attacks. They're not censorship. It's actually to take any potential dissident group and polarize them along some dimension so they can't cooperate with each other against that regime.
Love that aspect of building bridges. And how would you envision something like this taking root in a very polarized society like the United States today?
Well, just so you're aware, like the thing in Taiwan came out of the fact that not for 3 hours as in the United States, but for 3 weeks, they occupied the national legislature. And the government approval rate was 9%. So if you think we have challenges in the United States, they had some challenges there. And so this absolutely is intended for a highly polarized society. And in terms of pathways to get there, well, right now, Frank McCourt has a bid in to buy TikTok. And he has Audrey as a senior fellow helping to think about what it would look like. And, maybe that'll happen. Maybe we'll have a chance to put this into practice. Then I'm starting to work on a technical specification of what that might look like. So.
Yeah, super interesting. And also this issue of polarization is huge, seems to be a global phenomenon. And it's interesting when you say that, I'm calling in from the US and it seems like highest than ever.
So am I.
Yes. But I love your reference that it actually used to be even worse. So I guess we have hope and your work gives us hope. And I was also wondering, you mentioned the Polis as a mechanism for reducing this polarization. But another thing in digital democracy, in the case of Taiwan, is, during COVID, they had more of a say in what the government can do, right? And they had better systems in voting and showing what they like or don't like. And that's what Andrew Tang mentioned in some of his interviews, how, there's basically more engagement from the communities. But from what it seems is that oftentimes it's not so much the question whether you can vote, is that people don't want to vote. So in the case of Taiwan, how did they drive engagement in the political discourse? Because oftentimes, and especially in the US, right, a big issue is how do we get people to vote in the first place? And if you increase more voting options, it could, make it even harder.
Well, it's funny because we kind of have a dual problem. We've got like a lot of anger and whatever on social media, and then people don't participate. And I think the key thing that you need to do is you need to take the places where there's energy, and then you need to have that energy not be dissipated in heat, instead be converted into work, right? So that's, what they try to do. It's like they try to just say, oh, you're feeling like having a flame war on Twitter? How about you use that in a engine where that actually is sort of guaranteed to generate useful policy proposals rather than to just go up in heat.
And do you think that's possible in the United States?
Sure. You just need to change the algorithms. You need to change the incentive systems. I mean, let me give you an illustration. Like, imagine that we had a rule in Congress in the United States that if you had perfect bipartisanship, equal numbers of people from both parties, then you'd only need 50% support to pass a bill. But that if you have purely on one party, you need like 90% support to pass a bill. Think of how much that would change the dynamics. And that's just the beginning. Imagine now, like, of course, people are going to start working together across parties, but now there's going to be like some groups of Democrats and Republicans who work together a lot, and maybe they're always opposed to the other group. Well, imagine that it was just dynamic. It was like every time, the more you're working with people you've never worked with before, the easier it is to pass. And the more you're working with the same people as before, the harder it is to pass, right? Imagine how that would completely change the dynamics. Like the person who would be the most powerful, who would get to like the greatest position, would be the person who most has the capacity to see in everyone, no matter how much they've disagreed with them, the common spark of humanity that unites them and allows them to work together. You would like literally have voting rules that encourage the like Gandhis and the Martin Luther Kings of the world to rise to the top rather than the like demonizers of the world.
Yeah, and that's an interesting perspective. I think it's important to have these conversations, and especially in this political climate that we find ourselves in. And it seems to me, right, that when we talk about polarization, and then it's important to mention that diversity of opinions is fuel for social progress, right? And that's the whole premise of your work, from what I understand. And you talk a lot about the importance of inclusion. And again, I'm calling from the United States, where this issue is very present and the separation is very visible. And, there's also mental health crisis resulting out of it. And a lot of regenerative projects, talk about, you mentioned connection to life, right? And life is by design interconnected, and we are all connected to everything. And the sense of separation in a way is artificial. So what are some of the strategies and approaches you've seen on the local scale to rebuild the sense of connection? What are some of those local strategies? Can you share?
Well, look, I think the conflict is great. What we need is more conflict, more diverse conflict, not less conflict. The reason why we get into polarization is because we allow the one conflict to define everything. But the more conflicts we have, the less polarized we are. Because, if I am on a soccer team with a bunch of people from a different political persuasion, and I'm obsessed with winning and hyper competitive, the best thing I can do is to build strong relationships with people from the other side of the political aisle who are on my team, And if I'm going to, try to win on some issue that's not it's about a park in my neighborhood versus a park in your neighborhood, I'm going to have to ally with people from a different persuasion. And the more things we have like that, the more things that cross-cut the primary division, the more different conflicts we have, the less polarized we'll be.
What do you think are some of the best, platforms, especially on the local level, to, create spaces for, handling conflict? And have you seen any examples or particularly effective strategies for that? Because, a lot of the regenerative finance projects, as Maya said, are working with local communities, are creating local currencies and all that. But even in Dallas, conflict is still an issue that is present, but not always well managed and not always, openly talked about. So what's your take on that?
I think any community at any scale that wants to be solidaristic and dynamic has to always look to bring their community together, find what are the main lines of division, and encourage people to work together across those lines of division, maybe against a new line of division that then creates. So encouraging, whether it be sports, this is why it's such a classic thing that you get people together and you have them compete against each other in a way that's not related to whatever org structure, DAO membership, obsession with this cryptocurrency or the other, whatever the line of division is. Just have people engage in a conflict that is uncorrelated with that conflict. You know what I mean?
I love that. That's a good one. We'll definitely apply it. But I want to know as well, because, we are kind of meshing these real world, interactions with digital ones. And many people say that anonymity in the online space is an issue. You mentioned Twitter wars as well. So is that a challenge to democracy in the future? And do you see this as a problem that we have to work against?
I think anonymity and real names are both fictions. I don't think they ever exist. That name that I'm looking at right now on your screen is just a pseudonym that's constituted by a ceremony that your parents did at one point. And there's another pseudonym that's constituted by the set of first words that you wrote on a Discord channel. And there's another pseudonym that is constituted by the list of the last 3 cities that you visited. So we could give you any of those pseudonyms. They all represent various elements of your life. And the issue is that if we choose one particular subset of those and link everything to it, we undermine our ability to have agency and freedom. And on the other hand, if we don't link anything, we have no way to have confidence in each other. So what we need to learn to do is to escape this notion that there is the true name or the false name. What there are different sets of partially linked aspects of who you are that belong together within a context to give people confidence within that context that they're interacting with someone they for those contextual reasons can trust. And I think a lot of our problems, from polarization to these identity things, et cetera, all come from like both the practical and like, psychological difficulty of dealing with just the complexity of living in this modern world where there are so many different aspects of our identity. And the more we can build tools and build dispositions that help us cope with just how complex that all is, the better we're going to be at like not going to some like arbitrary tribe that represents 5% of who we are and then being like, and I hate all the people who aren't that tribe, even though you probably have more in common with the average one of them in 95% of who you are than that 5% that connects you to your tribe.
Yeah. And speaking of complexity, the complex human element and democracy also has inevitable impact on the environment that we operate in. And I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how this approach you take, the plural approach in the examples that you mentioned, can help us drive collaboration and more sustainable action. So how can you see your line of work help coordination around environmental issues?
Well, as I mentioned to you, one critical idea in all of this is not taking like one notion of the polity, one notion of the group as given, like the nation state or my city or whatever. Like, the set of people who live along a river and who benefit from it, the set of people who live with a lake or who live with mountains, these are a set of people who are tied together by something that they share. And it would be great if we could have a much easier way to have there emerge political democratic communities that can govern that shared resource democratically together. And if we could do that, then that thing would become sort of like this imagined entity, this new being. And that being would, just like corporate personhood, sort of have a certain kind of personhood itself. Now, you can imagine that that's some animist thing, that what you're actually doing is bringing that being that already exists, like in Shinto or in many indigenous traditions, you're just giving it a voice. Or you can imagine that you're just building a public goods community, a governance for that public good. But it doesn't really matter how you think of it ontologically. What matters is that we build the tools that enable that thing that is critical to the well-being of so many to have a polity that represents it, rather than just be this marginalized thing in the context of some much less relevant polity for it, like, the nation state or the city or whatever.
So what do you think about kind of doing this through blockchain technology? Because obviously the regional finance space is using the pre-technologies to, create a new coordination machine for the world, in a positive way. So what's your take on that space? And do you perhaps have any constructive criticism for it?
Well, I mean, look, there's definitely a use for a variety of technologies. Language models could be used to translate the sensor data from environmental features into speech and, literally become like the Lorax who speaks for the trees. And distributed ledgers have a role because they can create a set of representations of like what a community knows and commonly understands. But I think like the open public financialized blockchain is not necessarily like the best framework for thinking about what distributed ledgers have to give, because it, once it's open and it's public and you can trade everything, then everything becomes very speculative rather than grounded in like the relevant community that is actually associated with that thing. So that would be the direction I'd love to see these evolve, not open financial public blockchains, but rather privacy-oriented community blockchain, distributed ledgers for the set of people who are connected to a particular, say, environmental feature.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback for them. Hopefully some of the listeners will apply this approach more in their work. But speaking about Refi specifically, I'm curious, like at what point did you even encounter this Refi community, and what's your personal take on it? How much maybe do you align with the vision besides the criticism you already provided? Maybe are there any certain projects that you want to shout out to, or kind of tell us a story of your introduction to it?
Well, I'm curious about what you think about Refi. To me, Refi means, to a first approximation, like Gitcoin plus or something like that. Is that what it means to you, or how do you think about refi?
Well, that's why we have this podcast, right? And I think people have different takes on it. And one of the goals of this new season that we're recording is actually to expand on the idea of refi. So to me personally, I see refi for what it stands, regenerative finance. And that's why we have guests on the show who talk about building regenerative systems beyond the bubble of Web3. But I know that on, hashtag refi on Twitter, very much so is a more narrow conception of refi. Basically, how can we apply DeFi tools to regenerate the world? And so what's your take on there?
Yeah, I agree. And kind of experimenting with things like community currencies, impact tokenization, through these technologies that allow us to do that, or like supply chain traceability, for example, because I'm based in Colombia, in coffee supply chains, I think is really cool.
Oh, you're in Colombia? Yeah, I was there just a few weeks ago. I've lived in Colombia for almost 4 years total. So.
Oh, yeah. So you know a lot about the local issues here. And yeah, I think blockchain as a transparency tool, as a coordination tool could be really applied to some of those issues. But again, as you said, there should be a broader set of technologies, and we should not just necessarily apply technology for the sake of it, which we already discussed on another episode as well. But yeah, coming back to you, what are your thoughts on this? And we know that you were also on Kevin's podcast at Greenpill to talk about, quadratic voting, quadratic funding. So yeah, I'll let you also share.
I mean, look, Audrey is very influenced by the Tao Te Ching, the holy book of the religion of Taoism. And the Tao Te Ching very much has this thing of speaking in paradoxes. It says like do by not doing, like everyone recognizing beauty is what makes ugliness, and things like this. And, I think of refi very much that way. It's like, it's trying to put this regenerative idea together with like blockchain, which is this like generally perceived as anti-environmental, like speculative, greedy capitalist thing. So like I'm into refi mostly because it's like bringing together and trying to like have some reconciliation of these apparently contradictory things. It's building that bridge, and that's cool. That's what I, generally like about it. And I like Gitcoin because it's an instantiation of that kind of an idea. And I was involved in one of the technologies like that. It's trying to bring together sort of like capitalism with like, public goods funding, ideas behind democracy. So I think that's cool. And what else refi means other than, Gitcoin? Like, I'm not completely sure. I mean, you guys can educate me about that, but.
Yeah. So please listen to our podcast to learn more. And, you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, your perception of blockchain and Web3, but I'm curious about your personal story with it, because I watched some of your interviews and you started out as the harsh critic of blockchain. Then you became one of the main researchers in the blockchain space to developing, the mechanism that a lot of Web3 projects are using. Meaning quadratic funding and voting, that we will jump into that next. But can you explain how did your thinking about blockchain evolve over time and why?
So I wrote a book with Eric Posner called Radical Markets. And as we were finishing that up, one of my earlier papers about one of the ideas got tweeted by Vitalik Buterin. And I got like more Twitter traffic from that than I've gotten from everything else combined. And I, as a result, sent him the manuscript of the book, and he sent me back like 20 pages of the most thoughtful comments I've ever gotten before. My first reaction when he tweeted about me was like, here's this like 20-year-old, like, Russian, Canadian billionaire. This guy must be like some kind of mafia boss or something like that. But he gave really good comments. So that got me intrigued, and I started engaging with the space. And I found a lot of really interesting people, and I found a lot of really interesting issues and places where things that I believed in could be relevant and useful. I always remained sort of leery of the space and sort of the balance between my excitement about finding interesting people and ability to add something, using these cool mechanisms, and my sort of general disgust with the overall vibe of the space has sort of waxed and waned over time. But I don't think there's ever been a time when I haven't felt both of those as like very strong pulls on me.
I think it's impossible not to, just every day you go to Twitter and there's so much going on and you can feel all the things at the same time. But I'm curious specifically about quadratic voting because that mechanism has been around for a while. It's been a few years since you created it. What do you think about how it's been implemented, and how do you think it can be maybe improved upon or scaled in communities?
Quadratic voting is really cool. I have to say, there's been some good applications in the blockchain space. Even though it's been probably more used in the blockchain space than anywhere else, I'm probably least excited about the blockchain applications of it. Like, I think some of my favorite applications of it have been in the game Civilization 6, which is the best-selling strategy game of all time, and in the Taiwanese government and the Colorado legislature. So I think those have been really exciting applications. And it's also been used in the Web3 space, but maybe less excitingly than in some of those other places. I think there's a lot. I mean, quadratic voting is just like one step along the progressive voting rules, and there are many, many other things beyond it and simpler than it. There's approval voting, which is a simpler improvement on standard voting rules. Quadratic voting is more ambitious than that. There's more ambitious things than that, but like use groups and think about collusion, or that's what people call it in Web3. I would call it social relationships or something like that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just one step in a broad picture, and that's just voting. There's many other types of things beyond voting. But I think it's like a really cool illustration of the way in which you can use some simple kind of mathematical thinking and analysis to come up with something that just is a nice, clear improvement on your ability to express yourself in a diverse and pluralistic way. So,
yeah, and in the Web3 space, it's been mostly used by projects like Gitcoin, like you had mentioned, running these quadratic funding rounds and kind of fine-tuning it as they go. There's been different kind of improvements over time. I'm not sure if you've been following up on that, but have you seen maybe something that can be improved? Because, for example, some critique that I've seen is around, running these global rounds where you have different projects on different scales competing for funding. They have different, social networks themselves, and we're kind of putting them on the same scale. And again, Gitcoin has been, doing a lot of work to optimize for these things. But what would you like to see more of, perhaps, with these mechanisms?
Well, as I've mentioned before, and Gitcoin has been very responsive when I've made these comments, I think there should be many different kinds of rounds at different scales. I think your participation in the rounds should be some kind of identity marker that then affects how you're weighted in other things. And this has come in to some of these plural funding changes that have come to Gitcoin. So I think there's lots of ways to just make this richer, make it take account of social information, previous participation more. And I think that's starting to happen, which is cool. And another thing that I love about the community is that it's constantly, trying out new things. So,
yeah. And, we've touched on critiques of the Web3 space, what can be improved. But I'm curious, what are some of the common critiques you receive in your work now, especially in your, latest project on plurality? And how do you address those critiques?
I have to say, actually, this was not true of the radical markets. We got tons of critiques. If anything, the problem has been there's not enough pushback on this plurality thing. I wish we had more, because that's what helps generate progress. That's what helps push things forward. The biggest problems we run into are not critiques. It's people quietly trying to shut it down or on being unwilling to interact with it because of the Taiwan issue, because of the no copyright issue. There's a bunch of people who just feel threatened by those things and they just don't want to engage at all. There's been very little actual critical engagement. Whereas the previous book had tons of that. There's been almost none for this book, interestingly.
Interesting. And can you maybe share a little more about the book, because you have an interesting approach of open sourcing the content.
Yeah.
So
the book is fully open source. There's no copyrights, and we have dozens of people from around the world participating. So all of you are welcome to become co-authors of the book, and I hope some of your audience will want to be. Yeah, and it's democratically governed using some of these mechanisms that you talk about, the quadratic funding to prioritize issues, quadratic voting to approve pull requests, etc.
But can you share more? How is that going? How has it been writing a fully open source book? What are some pros and cons? As would you do it again? And if so, what would you do differently?
Okay, some pros are that I think it's been a huge part of why there's been such an openness to it and why there's very little critique because everyone can just change it if they, want to. Like, it's very hard to be like, you got it completely wrong. It's like, okay, please show me how I got it completely wrong, improve. And it's certainly a novelty feature. We've gotten a lot of really interesting perspectives. We've built like a large community of participants. On the downside, like weirdly, almost the opposite of what you would think. Well, we've gotten a lot of depth of participation and engagement. Actually, the breadth that you would think openness would encourage has actually been kind of discouraged by it because publishers won't engage with it. The mainstream media won't treat it like it's a thing because it's not a standard proprietary book. And so like precisely the openness has actually like limited the reach of its spread. So that's been really interesting. Like Radical Markets, which was so much more closed, actually reached more people more quickly.
That's an interesting insight. And are you planning to shift your strategies around, like getting more people to collaborate on the book based on that?
Well, I mean, we're doing lots of other objects, and I think many of those objects will be much more closed, like films and things like this, because they'll be able to have more of a commercial strategy. But, it's been very interesting that this book has like reached much more important and powerful leaders in a much deeper way than Radical Markets ever did. And yet it hasn't reached nearly as many people, even though you would think, again, the opposite, because it's open and the other one was closed.
I love that reflection, and maybe it's a big inspiration for the way we approach content generally. Like, do you want to collaborate with a smaller group of people, or do you want to push it out there? And something to reflect on for sure. But Glen, what is maybe next for your work? Can you share a little bit about what you're going to be working on in the upcoming months? What are you excited about? Well,
as we've been traveling the world, we've made connections with leaders in business, in arts, in government all over the world. And there's a number of things we want to follow up on that. We're working a lot on this idea of a Euro stack, which is like digital public infrastructure, sort of like the India stack, but for Europe. We've been working a lot on this TikTok bid, quite a bit on like data valuation. Another issue that I'm working on, like technical specifications for how that could work in a large transformer model. We've been working on this idea of like internet free world. So like how would you build an internet system that could be resilient against authoritarian regimes, that could be accessed by people inside of authoritarian regimes. Yeah, so those are some of the initiatives, but there's really tons and tons, and countries all over the world. We've been on 3 continents so far. We're going to 2 more shortly, and I'm sure we'll find even more initiatives as we travel around. Another issue that I'm very passionate about, by the way, is religion and technology. I think religion and spirituality are like the most underrepresented things in the tech world. And I think bringing those in is critical to the future of technology being acceptable and free in the world. So
I love that addition, and actually want to dive a little bit into it, if you don't mind. So what is then the connection between religion and technology? Because, I think we see spirituality as something so vague and so disconnected from technological advancement. So what is the bridge that you're building there?
Well, I'll give you a very concrete thing. So if you want to ask, like, what is my, and I'm a Jew, by the way, not a Christian, but I'll give a Christian version. If you want to ask, like, what's the problem with AI, with the AI discourse, I would say we just should do Christian AI. What do I mean by that? Like, what does the Bible tell us not to do? Don't build idols. What is AGI? It's an idol. Like, there's nothing that's more idolatrous than AGI. It's like you're literally building a god that you're going to worship with your own hands. In fact, you could say, what is God? It's general intelligence, right? And you're building artificial general intelligence. That's like literally the definition of an idol, right? And on the other hand, like, what is it that we're trying to build? Well, what does the Bible tell us to do? It says, the Christian Bible says, love thy neighbor as thyself, and that peacemakers are the children of God, right? And so, like, what is Polis? That's all it is, It's just in following those biblical injunctions to build peace. So we're going to build models that build peace, not that are idols.
I love that. And, this reminds me about another dimension of this regeneration as a paradigm shift. Oftentimes we think about finance and economy and how we change systems, but then it kind of all then boils down to elevation of consciousness. And I think a lot of regenerative initiatives do have a spiritual aspect in them. So I'm really looking forward to see your work in that realm as well.
And I'm curious, how do you see the role of the individual in all this? Because we have discussed, community dynamics, governance, and all that. But do you have any insights into how we can work individually to, let's say, regenerate our mindset as well?
Well, I think the first aspect is to get rid of the word individual. I think it's precisely by realizing how internally divided we are that we have a chance to be a laboratory for healing social conflict, because each one of us has within us like a bunch of identities that are in conflict with each other. And if we can accept that and let each part of ourselves forgive the other parts of ourselves, then we'll be a long way to forgiving all the social groups in society that we're in conflict with, because probably they're represented by some side of ourselves. I think most hate comes from shame. It comes from our inability to recognize in ourselves the temptations we see others succumbing to and to forgive ourselves for those temptations. So instead we externalize it to those other people and we hate them because they're that reflection of that thing we're embarrassed of in ourselves. And if we can instead forgive ourselves and accept who we are, then we'll have much less need to hate other people when we see those things in them.
That really makes me think of the short story, The Egg. I don't know if you know it. It's amazing.
Yeah, I'll read it.
I would also encourage our listeners to check it out. I think it very summarizes kind of what you just mentioned. Okay, Glenn, I think we're getting out towards the end of the episode, but usually what we do is that we have like 3 rapid fire questions that we'd like to ask you, and you can be as broad or specific as you'd like. Are you ready today?
Sure. I'm ready.
Good. So what book are you currently reading?
I need to figure out the title exactly. It's the modern book of Christian martyrs, the new book of Christian martyrs. It's a 1,000-page long account of Christian martyrs from, before the birth of Jesus to the present.
Oh, wow. What page are you on right now?
I think 800 or something like that.
Oh, wow.
I'm almost done.
Really cool. And next question is, what excites you the most about your work right now?
The way that it's changing me personally, how I talk, how I perceive people.
Is there like a quote, mantra, or concept that has really shaped you as a person that you want to share with us?
Well, a quote from the Tao Te Ching. It says, 30 spokes meet in a hub, and yet the useful part of the wheel is where it's empty. That we build the pot, but what holds things is the empty space inside.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, Glenn, are there any final thoughts, calls to action, specifically maybe for the Refi community that you want to end with?
Go on plurality.net, watch the trailer for the video about Audrey's life. Check out the book, contribute to the book.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Yeah, it was such a pleasure to have you with us. A lot of food for thought. Yeah. And we're really excited to hear what our listeners think too. So let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Live long and prosper.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Glenn. We'll make sure to link all your projects to the episode notes.
Take care. Bye.